How are you at answering tough questions? How are you at answering questions that are designed to trap you? On a light note, I heard this one the other day. A man rode into town on Friday. He stayed 3 nights and rode out on Friday. Well, the trick is, his horse was called Friday. Now that may be an old chestnut. It's the first time I'd heard it, but it's a trap question. On a more serious level, you may have been questioned by the media in an intense way. You may have been cross-examined by a barrister. You may have been involved in politics. For these people and these situations, trap questions are a reality. Many of us think of a good answer to avoid a trap 24 hours later when it's too late to do anything about it. But this is unlike Jesus, who perfectly answers questions that are designed to trap him. We're going to look at 2 of the trap questions asked by his enemies and hear his masterful answers. The first trap was laid by his enemy, the Pharisees. In response to Jesus telling 3 parables against them, we're told in verse 15, "Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words." The Pharisees sent their disciples along with the Herodians. Now the Herodians, we understand, were also enemies of Jesus. It was an unlikely partnership between the Pharisees and the Herodians. They disagreed over the payment of taxes, but were united in their desire to bring Jesus down through a trap question. When they found Jesus, they proceeded to flatter him with words. We're told in verse 16, "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are." While these words were insincerely spoken, what a true and awesome description of Jesus, a man of integrity. He taught the way of God in accordance with the truth. He was not swayed by others. After trying to butter him up with these words, they set the trap in verse 17. "Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" If Jesus were to say yes, people would wonder whether he was the Messiah, because the expectation at the time was that the Messiah would come and liberate God's people from Roman rule. If he were to say no, he could be considered a revolutionary and be in danger of being arrested. Well, Jesus knew their evil intent and their hypocrisy in pretending to be sincere when they were not. And he said in verse 18, "Why are you trying to trap me?" Through an illustration of a coin and a few basic questions, he replied in verse 21, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Jesus' answer avoided the trap in an amazing way. In so doing, he was able to show that the government has the right to be able to exist and to collect taxes, and that God is to be honoured. Their response was to be amazed, and then they left. Well, that was the first trap. The second trap. Well, it certainly was a tough day in the office for Jesus. We're told in verse 23, that same day, the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Now, the Sadducees were another enemy of Jesus, who were known not to believe in the afterlife and only believed that the first 5 books of the Bible were authoritative. In verses 24 to 27, they draw on the responsibility of a brother to marry his brother's widow in the event of a childless death, so that his name could be carried on. The Sadducees created an absurd hypothetical scenario of each brother dying, so that up to 7 brothers marry the widow and then she dies. The trap was then set in verse 28. "Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her?" Well, for some, this may be a very real pastoral concern. Encountering more than one former spouse in heaven could be very real for some people. However, the Sadducees were trying to show that Jesus' belief and teaching about the resurrection was ridiculous. The question was designed to trap Jesus, but Jesus is equal to the task and able to avoid such a threat. He knows their evil heart, just like he knew the evil intent of the Pharisees and the Herodians in the first trap. Jesus' response to them is what you would never want to hear. Verse 29, you are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. Jesus criticizes the Sadducees for the narrowness of their view of what the resurrection life would be like. They thought it would be just like this life, but Jesus is criticizing them for not knowing the power of God because he is able to transform things. Jesus specifically teaches in verse 30, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. While there won't be marriage in heaven from what we read in verse 30, he didn't say that there wouldn't be love. In fact, there will be perfect love and fellowship with God and with others in heaven. For some, this may be very hard to accept. Perhaps you are looking forward to being reunited with a spouse as a married couple in heaven. Well, there are lots of questions about what the state of our existence in heaven will be like, but the Bible says that we won't be disappointed. So there's no point in us getting all hung up about that issue. While Jesus is saying that the Sadducees were in error about their thinking about marriage in heaven, Jesus' bigger criticism is about their disbelief in there being a resurrection. Jesus is able to quickly dispel their view by quoting from the text that they find authoritative, as do we, going back to Moses' encounter with the burning bush, when God says to Moses, as it is in our passage in verse 32, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Jesus is saying that when God spoke to Moses a long time after the death of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is as much a God of them as he was when they were alive. So based upon this, it is reasonable to assume that there is a resurrection to come. Just like the first answer of Jesus, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. But what does all of this mean? So far, we have seen that Jesus is the master trap avoider, a man of integrity who taught the way of God. He was not swayed by people. He told us that there is a place for government, that there is the absence of marriage in heaven, and that the resurrection is something that is true. However, I don't think that this is what these scenes are about fundamentally. You must remember that Jesus was answering questions that were put to him by his enemies. They were set up as traps. Jesus' enemies were not wanting to enter into the classroom. They were wanting to enter into the battlefield for combat. What I find extremely striking in these scenes is the insight into the heart of his enemies, depicted most clearly in verse 18. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent. Perhaps this evil intent seems far off to you, relegated to a story thousands of years ago in a place and region of the world that is many miles away. Perhaps we could say that it was just these Pharisees, Herodians, and Sadducees that had this evil intent and were trying to bring Jesus down. And that doesn't have anything to do with you today. But then, there may be people who are listening today who would seek to trap Jesus if they could, in which case they would be no different to the Pharisees and the Herodians and Sadducees. The Bible, in fact, tells us that it's not just the religious opponents of Jesus' day that were enemies of Jesus. The Bible tells us that we are all enemies of Jesus until such time as we are made his friends. How concerning it is to read in John chapter 2, verse 24, that Jesus would not entrust himself to the people who saw the signs that he was doing, because he knew what was in each person. Jesus' desire was not to destroy his enemies in the scene. This didn't mean that he wouldn't give them a few rockets like we read in chapter 24 of Matthew's Gospel. Instead, Jesus' desire was that his enemies would be made his friends. He said in the Sermon on the Mount, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." A friend of Jesus is not someone who has evil intent against him in a settled way. He or she is not someone who tries to trap him. Instead, a friend of Jesus is someone who honours him, someone who follows him, someone who seeks to build up God's kingdom and not tear it down. What is needed to shift from being an enemy of Jesus to becoming his friend? I think that it is a heart that has been made clean, where evil intent towards Jesus is no longer a permanent resident. How's this brought about? It's brought about through the death of Jesus upon the cross and our response of turning to him, living for him, trusting that his blood has washed us clean of our sin. If you are an enemy of Jesus, you will be silenced on Judgment Day and you will face eternity without him. If you are a friend of Jesus, we are told that you can look forward to resurrection life for eternity with him. I want to ask you, which one are you? Are you a friend of Jesus or an enemy of Jesus?